Okay, and welcome back, students who are taking Math for Business and Finance and Math Applications, and we're continuing again with the summary practice test problems for Chapter 16, and we stopped on number 5 because I have to create a balance sheet. All right, and this is going to probably take this whole video. Now, this is the data that was given to you, and it's presented in the same way as in the textbook, but I'm going to use look at your textbook because I'm not going to bounce back and forth between the slides in order to be able to put the information on the balance sheet. Okay. But before we go into the blank slide and create it, what we need to do here is we need to think about these accounts and what category of account do they belong to. Remember, on the balance sheet you have assets and they're equal to liabilities plus equity. Okay, so building here, you have to, you think about building, well, that happens to be an asset. Okay, and building is actually a long-term asset. Okay, merchandise inventory, okay, that is also an asset, but that is more of a current asset. Okay, cash is an asset, and that's also current. Land is an asset, and that's long-term. Okay, long-term is the same as property, plant, and equipment. Okay, I'm just using long-term, but you'll see when we create the financial statement what property, plant, and equipment is. Okay, accounts payable is a liability. All right, it's not an asset. And the prepaid rent is an asset, and that's also a current asset. Right, my mortgage note payable is a long-term liability. It's a liability that's long-term, it's not current. Common stock is equity. Retained earnings is an equity account. Accounts receivable is an asset, and that's a current asset. I'm sorry, over here for the accounts payable being a liability, that is a current liability, by the way. And for the salary payable, that's what we owe, salaries payable. Whenever you see the word payable, that always is going to denote a liability, okay? So salaries payable is a liability, and since we're going to pay those, relatively quickly within a month, and remember the whole definition of current is between now and the next 12 months, okay? Well, obviously, I'm going to pay those salaries off in less than a month, so that makes them current. Okay, so once we've decided as to what kind of account, what category of account they are, an asset, liability, and equity, and in our secondary thought process as to whether they're current or they're long-term, now we can actually go and start creating our balance sheet, right? And in creating our balance sheet, we're going to need a heading, so we know it's for True Corporation, and we're going to label it as a balance sheet. And this is as of December 31st, 2014. All right, so let's come down here to a blank slide and start creating it. And remember, typing makes it all very, very neat, but I'm handwriting this, so I'm not gonna, I'm not worried about how neat it looks. And yes, I'm going to abbreviate a little bit, all right? But I am going to point out the formatting issues in creating this here financial statement. And so listen to what I'm saying and watch what's happening. Just realize that it's not going to be perfect because I am handwriting with this here digital pen. So first thing we need is a heading. So we're going to write the heading True Corporation. And I'm abbreviating corporation here. I should write it out. And then underneath that, we're going to write what financial statement this is. So it is a balance sheet. And now for the date, we can write the date two different ways. We can just put the date itself as December 31st, 2014, or I can write it like this. I can write as of December 31st, 2014. Okay, whichever way you decide to do it, whether this way or this way, both are correct. Okay. Also notice that this is, as far as my alignment is concerned, it's in the center. Okay. Now, the vast majority of the time, it is centered. And in any professional one that you're going to give to a third party, you're going to align it in the center. However, if it's going to stay internal to the company, meaning it's never going to be seen by eyes that are not employees of the company, and you decide to align it to the left instead, that's fine. Okay. I've actually never, ever seen where it's been aligned, the heading has been aligned to the right. Okay. I have seen to the left, and like I said, as long as it stays internal, that's fine. But professionally and leaving the company, it should be centered. Okay. Now, the next thing is we can create the balance sheet either vertically or we can create it horizontally. And vertically, what do I mean is we can put our assets and then underneath it our liabilities and then our equity. Or we can create it horizontally by putting our assets on the left and our liabilities and our equity on the right. Okay, and depending upon how many accounts you have will determine which way you want to do this, or which way the company has just decided to set up. You don't go changing it. You do it one way and you keep on doing it that way. You don't go and change the formats all the time. Okay, you choose one format and you kind of stick with it. And a lot of businesses like doing it this way for the simple reason our accounting equation is assets is equal to liabilities plus equity. Well, our assets are on the left and our liabilities and equity are on the right of the equal sign. Okay, so that's why they like to put it in this format, because our assets are on the left and our liabilities and owner's equity are on the right. And just as an additional FYI, for those heading into financial accounting, I just had a post on the student community today about how do you know, whether you're debiting or crediting assets, liabilities, and owner's equity. Well, the definition of a debit, and I realize that this is kind of a little bit beyond the scope of this book, but it's only going to take a quick second here. When you have general ledger accounts, you have to think in terms of what's called the normal balance, and the normal balance is what increases that account. Well, if I ask people what the definition of a debit is, they have a tendency to say plus. And if I ask them what the definition of a credit is, they have a tendency to say a minus or a reduction, a deduction. Okay, and that's not true when it comes to accounting, right? The definition of a debit is what's on the left. That's what a debit is. And the definition of a credit is what's on the right. Okay, so as a quick mnemonic here, a way of being able to think about it, when you determine, you sit and you say, okay, what kind of account is this? Well, cash is an asset. Okay, well, how do I know whether I should debit or credit it? Well, if my cash is increasing, I'm going to debit it, because why? It's an asset, and my normal balance of an asset increases on the debit side. The easy way to remember this is, if I have the cash account and I know cash is an asset, okay, because it's on the left-hand side of the accounting equation, I'm going to debit it. Okay. If I had, say, an accounts payable account, well, I know accounts payable is a liability, and to know whether I'm going to debit or credit it, if I'm increasing, right, the accounts payable is going up, well, because it's on the right, that means I would credit it. Okay, so make that for a note for yourself, because when you hit financial accounting, you're going to, that will help you out. Okay, all right, so back to this problem, since we're 10 minutes into it. We've determined that I'm going to do this horizontally by having my assets on the left and my liabilities and owner's equity and my equity on the right. Okay, so I put my label assets, and I'm going to put my label liabilities here. Liabilities, can't spell. And down here, I'm going to put stockholders equity. Now, for our assets, we've determined, because of the accounts, the number of accounts that we have, that we're going to separate and have current assets, and we're going to have, well, they call it plant and equipment, okay? Accountants call it property, plant, and equipment. And that's going to represent our long-term assets. And of course, when we add those up, we're going to have a total assets, which would be our current plus our property, plant, and equipment. So we're going to have a double underline down here. We can do the same thing for our liabilities. We can have current, and I'm going to abbreviate here, okay? We can have current liabilities. You should write this all out, okay? And then we also have our long, and I'm going to abbreviate long term as the LT, but you would write it out, okay? Long-term liabilities, and that's an abbreviation, okay? And then that's going to also give me a total liabilities. Okay, now notice I abbreviated that also, okay? But also notice that I indented it, okay? So, you know, here you're keeping these aligned, but I'm going to be doing certain indentations here, okay? And I'll bring those up as I go along. Now with equity, we don't have current and long term, because it doesn't matter whether someone invested a long time ago or they invested yesterday. Excuse me, they're just investors in the business. But because we're talking about stockholders' equity, we're going to have a total AL, total, I'll write it out here, total stockholders' equity. And then, since our accounting equation is assets is equal to liabilities plus equity, we have to add the liabilities and equity up. So we're going to have a total, and I'm abbreviating here, liabilities plus stockholders' equity. And I would write that out, I'm abbreviating. And of course, that would be the end of a calculation. And my assets here, right? My assets here have to equal my liabilities plus equity there when I get done with this. Okay, so that is sort of like the framework and structure of the balance sheet. Okay, yeah, you got to keep that in mind. Okay, this is one of those things where, you know, when you think about you have a certain amount of memorization, but you have to also have a certain amount of understanding. You know, you're going from current to long term, right? From current to long term, current to long term. Okay. And you're setting it up based upon the structure of the accounting equation, right? So now, current assets, and we can start filling in with our accounts, and you can refer to these in the back in the textbook, because that's what you're looking at here. So I'm going to transfer all of this information, all of these accounts and amounts, and put them in their proper places. Okay. So I had said under current assets, you know, I have cash was an asset and it was current. And that amount was $15,000. Okay, now I'm abbreviating here, but you would write it out. And also notice that I'm going to be working in two different columns here. Okay, for the simple reason, because I'm going to end up totaling up my current assets, and you'll see that as I go along. Okay, so I said cash goes here, and notice I indented. okay? Needs to have an indentation there. Underneath it, accounts receivable, and I'm just abbreviating there. You should write that out. And again, abbreviating, it should be written out. We know that merchandise inventory, again, abbreviate it, you should write it out, was 12,000. And prepaid rent was a current asset. So that's 9,000. Okay, and that's the total of them all. All right. So now notice I'm indenting again for my total, and I'm abbreviating current assets. All right. I'm indenting right here and writing in total current assets. And now I'm going to add these up, and instead of putting the figure here, I'm not going to put it here. I'm going to put it here instead. Okay. I drew an underline right here because that represented a calculation. And when I have the calculation, whatever my answer is, I'm going to put in the rightmost column. And that's going to be $45,000. Now, the first number in a column should begin with a dollar sign. Okay, so I write in a dollar sign here. The numbers that come after it don't have dollar signs. But we will put a dollar sign down here for our total assets and our total liabilities and stockholders' equity. Okay, so we have 45,000 here. Now, let's move on to the long-term section. Our plant and equipment, or property, plant and equipment, we indent, so we have land, and this is going to be a calculation because we have more than one account. So I'm going to put my dollar sign here and 90,000, and again I'm abbreviating, and then I have building of 40,000. Okay, so those are my two, and I'm going to have a calculation. So what am I going to do? I'm going to put an underline. I'm going to indent total, and I'm going to just write PP&E, but you would write that out. Okay, so that's an abbreviation. Write it out, and I put that to the right. The total amount of that is 130,000. Okay, now we know that our total current assets here and our total property, plant, and equipment here, our current plus our long-term is what gives us our total assets. So what do we need? We need an underline here showing that there's a calculation. And we end up with $175,000 as our total assets. Now, just as an FYI, because I wrote this, I'm writing this out on a piece of paper, you should not have this big empty space in between here, okay? You do not leave spaces, empty lines, because then, following generally accepted accounting principles, we would expect that something would go on that empty line. So we don't leave a space in between. We go from line item to line item to line item. Okay. And I have to move that up so I don't have spaces in between lines. Okay. So that's our asset side. Now I'm just going to try to draw lines down here. Okay. So that's our asset side, and I'm going to erase that line. By the way, there should be enough space in between your assets and your liabilities and equity so that you can, you know that the assets are on the left and the liabilities are on the right. All right, so liabilities next. Okay, we're going to indent, and we're dealing with current liabilities. So we're going to indent, and our first account is accounts payable, and I'm just abbreviating that. And since we're doing a mathematical calculation, a dollar sign for the first number, and we write $50,000. Okay, so we're going to have two columns here also, right? Next is our salaries payable, and I'm abbreviating this, and that's 8,000. And since we only have two current liabilities, we're going to underline because it's a mathematical calculation, indent and total current liabilities, and I'm abbreviating obviously. You need to write that out. And the total of that calculation goes right here. So I'm at I'm at $58,000. Okay, so then we have our long-term liabilities, and the only one that we have is, and I'm indenting, is a mortgage note payable. Okay, and I'm abbreviating obviously. Okay, now because it's only one item here, all right, it makes no sense for me to duplicate that by having a total long-term liability because it's only one line item. All right. So, and I don't have to put it in this column, add itself to itself in order to write the number over here. No, I can just automatically put it in the correct column, which would be over here at 70,000. Right. And of course, my total liability is indented. Okay. Again, this isn't pretty, all right, but you would have an indentation for the total liability. And because it's a mathematical calculation in this column, I draw the underline and I get my $sign and 128,000. Now I don't underline that because remember, we're going to take our total liability and add it to our stockholders' equity. Okay, so I don't put an underline underneath that because that's not where the calculation, is being made. The calculation will be made underneath the stockholders' equity. So I don't put an underline there. All right. Now to fill in the stockholders' equity, all right, I only have two accounts, and I put them all the way to the left. So that's common stock. But I'm going to add them up, so I'm going to put, I'm indenting. I'm using the one column to the left, and I put my 10,000 there, and then I have retained earnings, and I'm abbreviating here, and that's 37,000. Okay, and since that's giving me a total stockholders equity, I draw my underline, and remember this here is indented. Okay, and I should make that a little bit prettier, but I'm indenting a little bit, so I have total stockholders equity here, and the answer to that calculation goes over here of 47,000. Okay, and again, we don't leave an empty space in between here. Okay, because if you leave a space, you don't know if something is supposed to go under that, go in that space. So all the way to the left, total, and I'm abbreviating, total liability plus stockholders equity, right? And this is a calculation here. So I end up with 175,000 here, and I double underline it because that's the end of the calculation. And that's the end of this problem. Okay, and let me erase this. And except for not looking too pretty, all right, this is the way your financial statement should have looked like. Of course, we don't handwrite this stuff anymore. We type it all up, and it looks very, very nice and neat. But, and I'm not going to, since this video is already 24 minutes long, I'm not going to go back over and summarize everything here. I'm just going to point out that one, I used abbreviations, and when I abbreviate it, you should not use abbreviations. All right. Two, I wrote the numbers with a K representing thousands. All right. You should have actually wrote out the 3 extra zeros. And for those who are going into accounting, as part of the heading, you could have put a parentheses and then put in thousands here. And then instead of having all of these K's, you could have just written the number. Okay. So it would look like, oops, that should be 12. So that, everything would have a tendency to look like, all right, that's a 0 there. So your statement would have a tendency to look like this with just the numbers, not the extra 3 zeros, because we're showing that in the heading that we're saying all of these numbers are already in the thousands. So anybody who's reading this would know that this is 15,000. but for you really don't do that much with thousands. Okay, you have more of a tendency to do that with millions. So you would write in millions, and this way you can write, if I had 15, that means it would be 15 million, 9 million. All right, but when you're dealing with thousands, you're probably just going to write out the zeros. Okay, and I just happen to use the K in order just to abbreviate it. All right. Pay attention to indentations, right? Indentations plus indentations, right? So here's current liabilities. When I list the account, I indented, and then when I list the total, I indented twice, right? Pay attention to the columns. When you start out with one column on the right, but if you have a mathematical calculation that you have to perform, you indent. You go to the column, one column to the left, put in your numbers, add them up, and put the answer, the sum of those numbers, in the next right-hand column. So depending upon the statement, I can actually have 3 columns, or even possibly 4. I've seen them with 4 columns, all right, because that were that many mathematical calculations. Those who are going into accounting will see, more than one or 2 columns. Okay, you'll see 3 and 4 columns, especially in intermediate accounting. Okay, this here, having the columns is called multi-step. Okay, meaning there's more than one step. If you had everything presented in just one column, straight up and down, like in doing, your accounts this way, then that's what's called single step. Okay, and single step is not used that often. I mean, your financial statements have to be rather simplistic in order to use single step. Okay, but with that said, that's everything for now without getting too far in depth. But hopefully the extra information that I gave you, especially when you'll remember it or say, oh, I remember seeing that from math. When you get into financial accounting, it'll trigger in your mind and maybe help you out. Okay, so that's the end of problem 5, and I will do number 6 in the next video.